Well, hello, my friends. I hope you're all doing fabulously today. As you can see, I'm outside my workplace in the gardens. I've done a video here before and it was very nice, so no reason not to do another one. I wanted to return to, briefly return to this question of INFJs using functions that don't, strictly speaking, belong to their functional stack. I made a few videos on that topic. One of them was called INFJs Simply Don't Use FI, and I made another one called INFJs Simply Don't Use NE. Now, before I move on to INFJs Don't Use SI and INFJs Don't Use TE, I guess is the other function, I just wanted to kind of have a chat about what the reactions have been, because I've been a little bit surprised. I think I had underestimated I think perhaps the sheer amount of people in my audience, or perhaps newly arrived in my audience, who actually really subscribe to this view of the 8 functions model. So a couple of things to say about that before I kind of double down and provide more arguments for why you would at least benefit from asking yourself whether this is a very coherent view, as coherent as you think it is, right? So first, I just want to start first of all by saying, I think there are people who got emotional, people who were a bit upset over the language I use. So, because it was more polemical videos, more, the tone wasn't diplomatic. So I said, proof that these models are worthless, and people got kind of hung up on that word. So, let me take it back. If you think that from a descriptive point of view, you benefit from an 8 function model, let's say that it's valid for you until proven otherwise, right? So to declare offhand that they're all worthless, I agree with you that it's not very wise and it's not constructive. So that's one thing said. Okay. But of course, since I read pretty much all the comments to my videos from the audience, I don't have time to answer them all, and I hope people can appreciate, because there were some people who wanted me to answer. I was like, yeah, I don't have that much time. I'm sorry. So I try my best, but I really don't have that much time. But I just want to give you a few more clues as to why you ought to be suspicious towards those 8 function models. So for INFJs, the idea that you use NE, use FI, use TE, and you use SI, right? The first thing to mention is that the points that I made in my videos, they don't seem to have been fully understood by a lot of people. Like, it's almost as if I read their comments and I'm like, did you actually listen to my videos? Now, what this suggests to me is that there is a level of not so much rational attachment to the 8 function model, but almost like an emotional one, this emotional need to think that you're able to access all the 8 functions. So I really recommend at least try to have an open mind, maybe try to ignore the polemical nature of my discourse or the form, if you like, and listen to the actual arguments, because there are really strong arguments there, I think, to make you question whether 8 function models are viable. So that's one thing to mention. Just go back and listen to the arguments. But there's another one that came up, like that I thought was really intuitive and worth sharing with you. So I'll share it with you. So it's not to do with any specific function. It could be any function that's not part of your 4 function, main stack. Is this idea that's very clear in Jung that the less developed a function, the lower in your hierarchy, right? The more unconscious it is. I think we can all agree on this. So SC for INFJs would be pretty much, even if it's relatively well integrated, it's at least unconscious. The use of it is unconscious most of the time. Okay. Maybe if it's like for those for whom it is very well integrated, maybe half of the time it's conscious. You have a level of conscious control over it. If it's unconscious, you have no level of conscious control, which means that you cannot bring it about through your own volition. You can't decide, I'm going to be using this function, because by definition it's unconscious. Now, if you think that there are shadow functions, you think that by definition they are below the threshold of consciousness. So those shadow functions are in the unconscious. So they're in the unconscious. In other words, if they do exist and have influence over your personality, and I give lots of arguments why that is debatable, highly, highly, highly debatable. But also, you would have to accept that whenever you think that INFJs must have FI because they must have the traits that FI users have, otherwise they wouldn't be full human beings, you also have to say by the same token that this display of FI is always unconscious. They can never bring it about consciously, deliberately, intentionally, because that's incoherent with the whole notion of unconscious. Same with any time that you think an INFJ, surely they must be using any, or they must be using FI, or they must be using SI, you have to say by the same token they do that unconsciously. It's not part of their desire or volition. It's part of their desire perhaps, but certainly not rational volition, because it's not possible. Otherwise you have to embrace an 8-function model. It's something I mentioned in the comment, where you say it's 8 functions, and I can prove that it's possible to have a coherent and nicely coherent, or I should say predictive model with 8 functions. But then stop talking about the shadow, guys, because you can't just have your cake and eat it too. They need to not be in the shadow. The shadow just can't be the source of cognitive functions, because a shadow complex is too unstructured to have the form of a function. It's just everywhere in Jung, he says that, and it's just plain common sense. So if you want to have your 8-function model, you need to accept that those functions that are not in the main stack can be part of your conscious field. If they can be part of your conscious field, and so subject to your volition, as I think most people who want an 8-function model would want, they want to say, well, sometimes INFJs use any and they do that on purpose, they do that consciously. Can't be shadow. So you need to have 8 functions in your conscious field. Forget about the shadow. Now the question would suggest itself, in addition to the issue with overdetermination of theory by evidence, which I've already mentioned, and I think is a very, very big problem for any 8-function model. You have to explain how and in what circumstances an INFJ can just say, okay, I'm going to consciously use TE now, right? Just give me an example. And give me an example of how this can happen in a way that is completely controlled when it's done. Because if it's conscious, it's controlled. At least, insofar as it's in the conscious field. And in fact, if you are going to say that any can be conscious in this way, it has to be the kind of flip side of NI. So in fact, according to this model, NE would have to be very developed in an INFJ. And then where does that leave SE? How do you provide any explanatory power for the SE function? Right? So instead of being obsessed with having the most comprehensive possible descriptive model for INFJ life, try to think about models as the ones that just explain the evidence with the best predictive power and the least incoherence. So it's stop being obsessed with the totality of truth, because that might be the surest way to land you in difficulties. Think scientifically, scientisting in terms of what's the best predictive model, what can best explain this data with that data. And then, you can ask yourself the question. Now, just before I leave you guys, don't forget that I have written The Infinite Soul. It's INFJ Life in the Modern World. It's my new book. It's out. It's fresh out of the oven. People are loving it. So if you want a copy, want to hear more about INFJ leading purposeful, meaningful life in the world today, the link is below. Okay, see you guys at the weekend. Take care. Or maybe in short tomorrow.